The prosperity of your venture into Africa is our goal. We are committed to the success of every business in Africa. Africa Business Radio, towards a profitable Africa.
It's a beautiful Wednesday morning. My name is Soji Akinabi, and of course, thank you for joining me this morning on the show. Yes, we had to interrupt our normal programming in order to bring you this particular interview. And of course, this will be an introductory interview to a particular series that we're going to be running on this platform. Of course, so we're looking at the anthropology of entrepreneurship on the continent of Africa. And let me just give you a bit of background what anthropology actually means. Some would say is the studies of the origin, or an attempt to explain the origin, the culture, the belief, and the customs of a community, looking at the past and the present, and of course probably being able to predict the future. And of course some other people also say that archaeology, the study of historical remains and all of that, it's also a branch of anthropology. But of course, I am not the expert. We have the expert on the show with us this morning. Will be helping us to explain more what anthropology actually means, and also looking at the anthropology of entrepreneurship on the continent of Africa. I'm of the belief, of the opinion, that entrepreneurship started way back on the continent of Africa, and we need to look at where we're coming from when we're talking about entrepreneurship, so that we'll be able to explain where we are, and where we are going. I have on the show this morning, I have Dr. Lulu Gwagwa. I hope I got that right. She is a multifaceted woman. She's an accomplished development planner, a business leader, and also a philanthropist. And also, she's also a writer and a photographer. Oh my God, that's quite a lot. And of course, she will be helping me this morning as we'll begin to talk about the anthropology of entrepreneurship on the continent of Africa. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning, Soji, and good morning to your listeners.
Yeah, thank you for finally agreeing to have this interview. Like I said, this interview is long overdue, and I'm glad that we are finally able to connect and have this interview. I just lost Dr. Lulu right there, but of course she will be back. Like I said, anthropology is an attempt to explain the culture, the beliefs, and the norms of a community, looking at the past and of course the present. And Dr. Lulu, good morning. Of course, she's not back yet. So let's just look at a bit more on what anthropology actually means. So like I said, archaeology is also a branch of anthropology, like some people will say, but we also have what we call economic anthropology, which is also an attempt to explain human economic behavior in its widest historical, geographical, and of course cultural scope. And that is more reason why as Africans we need to understand that there is an history to actually how we do what we do and what we do. So, and that's why we're looking at the history of the foundation of entrepreneurship on the continent of Africa. Yes, like I said, there is economic anthropology, which also it's also a part or a branch of general anthropology, which began with began with the Polish British, who is the founder of anthropology. We also have what we call political anthropology, which is also political economy, actually, which also tried to explain the political economy in anthropology, which is the application of theories and methods of historical materialism to the traditional concerns of anthropology, of course, which includes non-capitalist society and, of course, also capitalist society. So the concept of capitalism and socialism and all of those also can be linked back to anthropology generally. And just also to also look at what some other people have said about anthropology, especially anthropology of entrepreneurship. The economic entrepreneurship theories are the classic they are the classical theory, and also the neoclassical theory, and also the Austrian market process. I don't know what this means, but I guess Dr. Lulu will help us to unpack this. Good morning, Doctor. Are you back?
Just come back again. So I've missed everything you were saying except when you were doing just the introduction.
Yes, I don't know what happened to the network. Just tell us a bit more about yourself before we get into the conversation fully.
Yeah, as I said, Soji, my name is Lulu Gwagwa, and I come from a small rural village in Umzimkulu in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa.
Okay.
And I, as you said in the intro, I am a town planner by training, but have moved from town planning. I mean, I did everything from working in the public sector and the private sector, and also academia as a town planner. But I've kind of moved into business over the last decade. So I'm currently in business, and I also do other things, as you said, philanthropy, working with young women, but I'm also a keen writer and photography, and I'm currently also studying philosophy, which is I find quite interesting.
All right, that's quite a lot. I feel like you have done everything that people like us want to do when it comes to career. All right, let's just get into it. So, anthropology, how would you explain what anthropology is about?
Well, I'm not an anthropologist, as I say. I'm a town planner by training. But if I look at anthropology, I would say it is a study of human beings.
Okay.
And so I will simplify it for myself as a study of human beings and their being and their history and where they are. So it is a study of human beings and their history.
Interesting. All right. So, now talking about, you say you're a town planner, obviously, looking at, the historical, concept of town planning in Africa. So I think we can just start with that. A typical African community, how would you describe, the way it is, from the perspective of a town planner?
I think as a town planner, if you look at the conning, firstly, town planning or town and regional planning, as I call it, I always start off by saying it is about essentially, although people look at it from a design point of view, which is physical planning, I look at it slightly differently. I call it an allocation of resources.
Okay.
Because if you, as a planner, look at an area and say this is where schools should be, this is where roads should be, and you have to prioritize because always we don't have enough resources. So you are allocating resources, you are making political decisions, although you are not a politician, about what should go where and who should have access to what and when and how. So I look at planning essentially from that. So when I look at something as a planner, I'm always very conscious about the social political implications and consequences of my decisions. Because if you look spatially, for example, in any country, you will see that people that are in urban areas in general have got more access to resources and to infrastructure, and in rural areas there's not adequate infrastructure and resources. So already you can see that there's inequality right there in terms of just the spatial makeup of a country. But also if you look globally, there's the East, there's the West, again, that's space. That is spatial makeup of the globe. And so everything else is about how do we make sure that an ordinary African girl that's born in a rural village in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa has the same life chances as a as a male, a white male for that matter, that is sitting in a South African city like Johannesburg, in Sandton, do those two people actually have the same life chances? The reality is that they don't. The other one starts from an advantage purely by where they are located spatially.
Okay, I like the fact that you started from the allocation of resources and also talking about equality to making sure that everybody has the same access to opportunities and all of that. So let us also look at from the philosophical perspective, a typical African economy. What is the concept around the allocation of resources and the economic setting historically?
I think if you look historically, in terms of the allocation of resources out in rural areas, you started off by saying everybody has equal chances of having access to land in order to plow. Plus, also in rural areas where I grew up, if you had less, those households or families that had more, they would be able to lend their ox and their cows to another household who had less, or maybe a family of a widow to actually plow their land. So there was that in a community, everybody existed in a community. So there was no child who was an orphan in the Western understanding of what an orphan is, because a village brought up a child. So the whole concept of actually growing up in a village meant in a community. So philosophically, an African person, there is no person that exists as an individual. A person is somebody who exists within a community. You are because I am, and therefore I'm a person to the extent that you define me as a person. And a person in an African context is somebody who's got a moral standing in a community that behaves in a particular way. Somebody who performs duties and obligations and supports the next person. So philosophically, that's what African personhood is.
I actually like that. In a typical African community, there's no orphan. I mean, because like they said, a child is being raised by a village. And so looking at that, how do we bring out the concept of entrepreneurship from that? Because obviously, like you said, some other people will lend other people their cattle for grazing or something and all of that. How is it that we used to, drive entrepreneurship then, historically looking at all of this that we have said, the fact that we live as a community, as a people, as one, how is it that we can bring out the concept of entrepreneurship? Because some other people talk about the concept of trade by barter, but I think there is more to entrepreneurship within an African context historically than just trade by barter.
Yeah, I think, Soji, for me, you're raising a very, very important point here to say within an African context, there are those African values that really we can bring to bear instead of throwing them away within a capitalist context. But we can actually bring some of those to bear as we look at how do we grow our economies and how do we make certain decisions. I think for me, the starting point is that consent for the other. So if as an entrepreneur within an African context, you started off, any entrepreneur, you look at what is the gap, what is the need out there. And then you say, how do I satisfy a need? Plus also you look at your own creativity around that particular need. So I think that if we looked closely at our communities, meaning at our countries, and say where are the gaps and what's required, and as an entrepreneur, we came into entrepreneurship with a social conscious. I think for me that would go very far. Instead of looking at purely at, of course, an entrepreneur, you have to make profit. That's a given. But if you said, how do I make sure that my business talks to real needs out there, number one, and number two, how do I make sure that the way I actually carry on my business, it's underlined by ethical values, and also how do I make sure that as an entrepreneur, I run a sustainable business. A sustainable business that doesn't come in here and just chop off all the forest. It does actually look at sustainability. Is you actually investing in the future. That is how historically economies, historically African economies ran. Even in small villages, people were always looking at how do we make sure that this community is sustainable. You still made a living,
yes,
but you made sure that it's sustainable. So in agricultural economies, it was always decided about where is the part of our land where we plow our crops. Where do we take our livestock? And if you I mean you're probably much younger than the rest of us, but you actually also rotated the fields. So the cows would be grazing in this area this month, and then the next month or the next season they will be moving into another area. That was about sustainability, looking at the sustainability of the environment. So the issue of an environmental management is not something that's new in this continent. It's something that this continent understands very well. So if we're able to then, as entrepreneurs, really build from that, and I do want to emphasize the issue of an African person is somebody who's got moral standing. Yes. And therefore, the issue of corruption and the issue of disregard for the other and the poor is historically
anti-African.
Something that was not there in the African context. Because in the African context, you are a person not because you've got flesh and blood. A person is somebody who is morally accountable to the community. So if our leaders were to aspire to be persons, which is what is a person in the African context, a lot would change, Soji.
I do agree with you, man. I do agree with you. Also, historically, I don't think there were poverty in Africa. I don't think there were the burden of unemployment in Africa because there were a lot of land for everyone to cultivate. And so I feel there is a desperate need for us to go back to history, to where we're coming from, so that this concept of high unemployment rate that the problem of high unemployment rate that we're now dealing with in our community, in our society as Africans, the problem of poverty, hunger, we can eradicate them. I mean, what do you say about that?
I think as I say, I think there's a lot that we can do if we borrowed from our past without romanticizing the past. I mean, there are many things that, the world has moved on. So for me, it's a question of how do we draw from our historical communities from an ethical, from a moral point of view, and our concern from the other. Because then it means that when we look at the economy, we are not looking at how much can I make on my own just for myself. I'm also just as concerned about my workers. So the gap between the CEO and the cleaner, if you looked at it from that point of view, you'd be able to actually look at those head on and address those. But most importantly, also, Soji, for me, is a concern about technology. I think if you look at this continent, the issue of technology, the issue of architecture, so we come from far. If you look at North Africa, you look at Egypt, you look at West Africa, there's a lot in terms of innovation that comes from this continent. So it is about us looking at what our needs are and innovating and also bringing to bear technology, because we can't run away from technology, and say, how do we bring to bear all of those into the natural resources that we have? We've got rivers, we've got minerals, we've got land, arable land, we've got forests, we've got all of this. So how do we bring to bear technology and how appropriate technology that takes into account the nature, demographic nature of the continent, and also that takes into account what the needs are in terms of development of the continent. So it is about, at the bottom of it, social entrepreneurship, which is about a concern for the other and the concern also for the environment and the sustainability of the continent.
I do agree with you, Doctor. But finally, we don't have a lot of time. Let's just talk about preparing the next generation. Of course, you've spoken about technology, the fact that right now things have changed. And as much as we're trying to take some lessons from the past, and we also have to move forward, looking at where we are currently, how do we begin to raise a new generation of Africans with the understanding of who they are, where we are coming from historically, and what is it like being an African, like you said, a person in the context of an African community? How do we begin to raise a new generation of Africans like that?
Soji, I would raise 3 points really for the youth that I'm really passionate about. I think the first one for me is education. Education and entrepreneurship are not mutually exclusive. This idea that for me to be an entrepreneur, I must leave a school, really is not on. There aren't those many Bill Gates, really somebody who dropped out of university and still made it big and also changed the world. So I'm arguing for young people that are educated, because I think there's a lot in there in terms of supporting your entrepreneurship ideas and also to broaden your mind and the way you think. That's what education is about. It's helping to shape your thinking and the way you think, so that when you look at problems, you look at challenges, you've got a broader mind to look at complex issues that we deal with in the 21st century, which were not this complex in the 16th century. Let's agree on that. So education and entrepreneurship for me are partners. So I want to really, really emphasize on our youth that education is very important. The second one for me, Soji, which is just as important, is to make sure that we look beyond our borders as Africans. We look beyond our immediate background. So if you are like me, you are born in a rural area in Tumuk, in South Africa, in a province of KwaZulu-Natal, look beyond that and look at partnerships outside your immediate environment. Because those people they come from different backgrounds. It is about diverse teams. It is about diverse way of thinking and looking at challenges and problems that we can really solve complex problems of the continent. So it is important, and I would emphasize that in particular to South Africans. And I'm a South African myself, so I can say this, that South Africans, we tend to be, and I'm generalizing here, parochial in the way of looking at things. So we'll need to look beyond our immediate countries to say, how can I find partners in West Africa, in East Africa, in North Africa, in Central Africa, to really, really broaden our minds in terms of the problems that we're dealing with. So the issue of networking, of looking at a pan-African approach to things, I think for me is important. The last one, Soji, for me, it is ethics, integrity. That's the only way. We have to look at the long term, because one of the issues that leads us to unethical business conduct and corruption is about being short term about things, wanting to make R1 billion like today. It is not about that. It's not sustainable. So running a proper business, proper governance, being an ethical business person is the only sustainable way. So I think that driving the issue, which is what being an African is, as I said, for me as a philosophy, a scholar, what is African person? What is an African person? An African person in the first instance is defined around morality. So, I mean, young people, morality, we've got to make morality and ethics fashionable and cool. So those would be the 3 key issues for me, Soji.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Doc. I think this conversation needs to continue. Like I said to you, this is an introduction into a series that we want to do. And I love the fact that you are able to emphasize on the fact that an African person is defined around morality and ethics, and so that we don't get it twisted. Some other people would think that when you're talking about corruption, they would think it's an African problem. No, it's not an African problem.
It's anti-African, in fact.
Yes, it's anti-African, actually. All right. Thank you, Doctor. Guys, we're going to find time to actually bring you back so that we can take this forward. Thank you very much for your time this morning. The podcast of this particular interview will also be made available so that we can circulate this as much as possible to young Africans in order for us to actually begin to interrogate the current reality and go back to where we're coming from and be able to understand who we are as Africans. Thank you very much, Doc.
Thanks, Soji.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye. All right. That's quite a powerful one, actually. There's nothing more that I need to add to that. An African person is defined around morality and ethics. And of course, until we go back to that, we might not be able to get to where we are going as Africans. And we've got to make that also more fashionable right now, especially as we're preparing the next generation of African. That's about all that we have for you this morning on this particular insert within our programming. My name is Sojia Kinabi, and of course I'm very much excited about the Anthropology of Entrepreneurship series that we're going to be running on Africa Business Radio. We'll try as much as possible to bring you more people, and of course also bring back Dr. Lulu to expand more on some of the points that she has made this morning. Please stay engaged with us at Africa Business Radio on Twitter. Sorry for that. Africa Business Radio on Facebook as well as LinkedIn. Of course, don't forget to also download our mobile application either on your Android or your iOS devices. And of course, for me, it is goodbye.
Unique insight into doing business in Africa. Investment opportunity. Industry updates. Africa Business Radio, towards a profitable Africa.